Welcome to the DRS Train podcast. This service is the forgotten rivalry Ickx versus Rindt. I'm your driver, Peter Brook, and your conductor today is NavF1. Welcome, man.
Hi, looking forward to this very old season from 54 years ago.
So today we also have a new guest, DanNoSkill. Welcome, man.
Hey, how's it going?
So before we begin, do you want to tell everyone a bit just about who you are and what you do on your channel?
Yeah, so I'm the guy who probably pops up in your F1 Shorts feed, waffling about something from F1 history or modern F1 news. But I also make quite a few long-form F1 videos too. And I covered partly the Rindt crash and partly the Ickx rivalry in a couple videos, and I thought it'd be cool to hop on here and talk with you guys about it because it's a really interesting topic.
Yeah. So this is the furthest back we've gone so far in our kind of history episodes. It's an interesting year because Rindt is in quite a unique position as being the first and so far, well, hopefully only posthumous world champion. And for that reason, I think people sort of overlook the rivalry nature because it seems kind of one-sided, because the story is that he was so far ahead by the time he died that there wasn't enough time in the remaining 4 races to for Ickx to catch up. But these two, yeah, it was interesting because they'd had rivalries in the years before this, 69, 68 as well. And I think there's kind of more going on there than most people would realize.
You talk about 69. When I was reading about that as well, so obviously he's with Lotus for 1969. He moved from, was it the Brabham team I think he was with before that? And him and Colin Chapman, they really didn't get along. Like, I was reading, basically, the Lotus car that year was pretty awful reliability-wise, which is why we lost. He ended up losing the title. So Rindt kind of had a shaky relationship with Chapman, and then going into 70, the only reason he stayed was the promise of a better car.
Yeah, I mean, Colin Chapman often had strained relationships with some of his drivers because as good as the cars could be on track, they weren't particularly robust and particularly safe. And this was a criticism that Jim Clark had, and obviously he ended up being killed in one of his cars in a Formula 2 car. And the same thing with Rindt, who was a fairly safety-conscious driver, which was something he shared with Jackie Stewart. But yeah, it was, I think, definitely getting a better car. I think you can, that's definitely a promise he could keep, because Lotus had, they'd introduced, up until this point, they'd introduced virtually every kind of revolution in car design, having the first monocoque chassis and then the first aerodynamic wings, and the 72, which they brought this year. It was pretty much the first Formula One car to have the sort of modern shape that we see now, of having the wings fixed directly to the bodywork instead of on these massive pillars joined to the suspension, and the side-mounted radiators and everything. It was a very, very forward-thinking car in many ways.
Yeah, it was forward-thinking. We must say that there were suspension problems when the season started, and again, that can be attributed to the fact that Lotus at the time was always, championing innovation. There's also the fact that, as you said, it was always quite an unreliable car, and it was always prone to just breaking, and it wasn't a safe car by any means. Jochen Rindt, before the season, just, he said, in a Lotus, you either win or you die. And, well, he did both, which is insane to think about. And that was really just, well put by him, because those cars, no one considered them safe. None of the drivers on the grid considered them safe. And when you signed for Lotus back then, and as Dan said, when you were working with Chapman, you really put your life on the line with the prospects of winning.
So yeah, if we look into this, so the 1970 season, for that, so Rindt it was now his second year with Lotus. The first year he'd had several pole positions, but only taken one win, because again, this is reliability not really being on his side, and the title went to Jackie Stewart that year. It was the first year for March, who ended up being playing quite a large role in F1 history, because they dished out cars to a lot of teams in the 70s, and Max Mosley was one of their founding members, and he would go on to become FIA president. But yeah, and you also had the defending champion Jackie Stewart, who had gone from Matra to Tyrrell, So there was a few changes. It also ended up being the final year for Jack Brabham, who managed to win the first race in the end. So it was quite a big transition year in terms of drivers coming in and coming out, and also teams, and also just a turning point in car design as well.
So as well in this year, you had kind of that engine difference too. So there was the Ford Cosworth engines that were like coming in. Everyone sort of knew how they worked. A lot of people wanted them. But then there was also the V12 Ferrari engines, which I think, and also I think a couple of the cars were in the V12 as well. And everyone sort of expected them to do better than they did at the start. I know you can kind of, we're just trying to set the scene here, but for example, you'd expect Spa, right? Quite a long straight of a track. You'd expect the V12, a lot of power to do well there. But the problem was near the start of the season, especially, they were plagued again with that reliability issue. So there was that competition in the engine department where it's like, do you want the old reliable Ford Cosworth, or do you want the V12 for like new engines, sort of a bit riskier but potentially more powerful?
Yeah, I mean, Formula One doesn't have the best history with V12 engines because it's easy to think, oh, more cylinders, more power. But when they had them in the 90s, they weren't particularly successful. It was V8s and V10s that were better. It's kind of hard to picture cars from this era having V12s because they were so small. If you compare these cars to, say, the modern Formula One cars, they're literally about half of the length and probably not much narrower as well. And so you would expect them. They didn't really deliver the kind of power that you would expect at the time. And at this point, it was still the Cosworth DFV was now, it had been around since 1967. It was the one that basically every team was using except Ferrari and a couple of others. And that was still really the way forward, because through the 70s until the ground effects era, Formula One was kind of almost a spec series in many ways, because almost every team was using the DFV, same Hewlin gearbox, same tires, and I guess just trying to work out where best to go with suspension and aerodynamics at a time when they were both quite primitive still.
Yeah, and also, as you said, drivers had to consider which car to just choose, because, yeah, you could have performance, but then that could mean no grip, or that could mean no life. And there was this balance at the time, which, yeah, it led to many drivers leaving and coming in, and new manufacturers trying to, just have a go at it. But when you look at the 1970 season, I mean, the Ford engines just dominated, apart from Ferrari doing well. So it's really a case of, was it worth it even to try to challenge Ford as an engine manufacturer as well?
Yeah, I definitely want to expand, because you mentioned like all the drivers coming in and stuff. For people that don't know, especially those who are maybe watching and haven't looked, like you said, this is one of the furthest you've gone back on the podcast. Through this era, it was so common, wasn't it, just for teams to bring in different cars throughout the year and just try anything. So you'd see drivers chopping and changing throughout the season, and cars as well, just being brought in halfway through and then taken out to be developed a little bit more. So it was a time of radical change in Formula One, I guess you could say.
Yeah, it was very common. You would see a lot of drivers who would do just one race for one team, and then the next race they'd be with a different team, or they'd bring back an old car because the new one wasn't working. And that's exactly what Lotus did in 1970, because they introduced the Type 72, but then they did it for one race. It wasn't very good, and so then they brought back the 49 for three races, or 3 or 4 races. So you could kind of get away with that because the rate of development was so slow. Whereas these days, you couldn't say, if Red Bull just decided to use the 2022 car last year again, they would have, I don't know, they may not have won any races, even though the cars are basically the same, because the rate of development and how small the field is in terms of the pace difference, it makes a huge difference. But back then you could get away with throwing in an old car because the rate of change was so slow.
Yeah, and expanding on the driver thing, just putting some numbers on it. Even if you look at the McLaren main team, they had 5 or 6 drivers. during the year. Tyrrell had 3 drivers. Lotus had 5 drivers, obviously, because Jochen Rindt passed away. So it was in some way quite entertaining. Obviously, F1 was not as big back then, but when you're looking back at those times, you just look at the results. You would have drivers just hopping in for 2 races, getting a podium, then leaving, and you might never see them again. And in some way, it makes it really entertaining to look back at those seasons. And well, even just looking in terms of the context, would you say that 1970 was setting out to be a classic even before it started?
I definitely think so. I would actually compare, if we were going to sort of compare it to a more modern season, if you look at the 2012 grid and the 1970 grid, I would draw a lot of comparisons. You've got those old champions, you've got Brabham and you've got Hill. I think Surtees in there as well. Stewart, who's just coming off the back of a championship, which you can compare to like your Vettels, your Schumachers, Hamiltons, Alonso's of 2012s. And then you've got sort of young, fresh talent as well. Champions to be, Fittipaldi getting his debut this year. Obviously, Rindt, who's going to be challenging for the championship and has been a strong contender. You can compare that to sort of your Rosbergs, who are in that 2012 season. You've got sort of your Buttons too, who are those strong drivers who are worthy of putting in a good race here and there. So definitely, I think the grid and the amount of drivers on there and the caliber that they were, I think I calculated it, and they would end up altogether with about 14 world championships between them all. It was a really, really strong grid.
Yeah, I mean, it's not hard to see. You just look at the drivers who were there, as you said, all the champions, but even Cleo Gazzoni, Pedro Rodriguez, Chris Hammond, who's often seen as maybe the best driver to never win a race. Well, until Lando decides to not win a race for the next 4 seasons. We'll see. But yeah, I think it's time to look at the actual champion for that season, Jochen Rindt, and just how that went for him, because obviously there was a lot of competition, as you said, a lot of expectations on just several drivers on the grid. As you said, that there was so many drivers who are not remembered at all, but Joe Siffert, Chris Amon, Piero Gazzoni, they weren't champions, but they were very good drivers. And Rindt, well, he powered through to several wins, which obviously put him in a position where, well, he became champion before the end of the season. Would you say that he was expected to be this good? Because Jackie Stewart always had a lot of praise for him. We know that Stewart was always very classy, and he always gave credit to his opposition. But he always seemed to just put Jochen Rindt maybe a bit ahead of everyone at that stage. We must remember that Sebastian Vettel, who knows a lot about F1 history, said in this random Grill the Grid video, it was a random just holiday video about who would you want to be stranded on a desert island with? And everyone's just naming their teammate or their just friends on the grid. Then Vettel says Jochen Rindt, because I would love to ask him about his career and his life. And I think that says all you need to know about how fascinating that guy was as a driver.
I think when you look at just his F1 results, it can deceive a little, because because he finished 3rd in 66. He didn't get his first win until 1969, by which point he'd been in F1 for 5 years. But then what you need to remember with Rindt is that he was very good in Formula 2, and this was a time, obviously, when F1 drivers would do lots of other stuff outside of Formula 1. And he was European Formula 2 champion 1 year. He won Le Mans in 1965 as well. So he was really kept very active by that and had a lot of success there. But for Formula 1, he'd had for example, 1968, that year he only finished twice, but both times it was a podium. And 69, I think that was a year again he got several pole positions, and it only took 1 win, and thought maybe it could be a year that he could do it, but mostly reliability was what kind of got in the way. But yeah, it was by 1970 he'd finally got a decent car, But it still took a few races to actually get into a rhythm and get onto that winning streak. There were a few breakdowns at the beginning, which kept the title close in many ways.
Yeah, just quickly on how you said drivers used to do a lot of things. Jochen Rindt really got his first moment in the limelight when he won a Formula 2 race at Crystal Palace in London, where there used to be a race, and he beat Graham Hill to the win. And the headlines at the time were "Unknown Austrian beats Graham Hill," who was obviously a hero, especially in Britain at the time. So yeah, we cannot understate how important those non-championship races or the Formula 2 races were at the time. They were really a way to prove yourself, because Formula 1, you needed the car, and also you just needed the reliability above anything. You needed the opportunity, which wasn't given at all in the 60s.
Yeah, on the reliability side of things, when obviously Rindt having that opportunity in 1970, getting a little bit more luck, his consistency, I think, for a driver was sort of unmatched at the time. If you look at his results in 1970, every race he entered, he either didn't finish due to a mechanical problem or he finished first. So he had that, I think, extra oomph that gives a driver that domination where they're not just fast, but they're fast consistently and they don't make that many mistakes. And I think that's why Rindt sort of, especially like you're saying, Jackie Stewart, he really respects Rindt. And I think that's why. It's because on his day, given the right car and everything, he will just put it and maximize it, which is what I think a legendary F1 driver kind of needs.
It's interesting as well because about him being safety conscious and the quote, "At Lotus, I can either be world champion or die," because this was another kind of transitional point for 1970, is the drivers and the sport in general were becoming very safety conscious because of him. There was Stewart who was kind of calling this out because his sort of big awakening to this was Spa 1966, I think, was the year when he ended up upside down, being doused in petrol, and then he went to the medical center and it was just a square bit of concrete with a tent over it or something, and he was like, yeah, this is not good enough. But 1970 as well, because they raced at Spa that year and then they ended up cancelling any further races there because they were still using the very long original layouts that went all the way down to Stavolo. But they'd done very little. They'd put in a few Armco barriers, but otherwise they hadn't really made much effort to make it safer because you were still blasting past hay bales and ditches and telegraph poles and barns and houses and that sort of thing. So that was kind of another important aspect of this year was greater attention to safety. And they were kind of forced to, because as well as Rindt, there was also the death of Piers Courage at Zandvoort, and so we kind of finally started to see the first real pushes to improve safety, basically.
Yeah, it was really a time as well, I think, where F1 drivers were becoming more celebrities, I think you could argue, than they'd previously been seen. F1 was no longer in its infancy. It had made a name for itself. It was 20 years old at this point. So the drivers could also demand a bit more. They were pushing for the safety to be improved. We'd obviously had recently, I think, the removal of most hay bales at circuits after a crash in Monaco, obviously catching fire. I can't remember which driver it was, but costing them their life.
Lorenzo Bandini.
That was it, Bandini. So, yeah, drivers were pushing for safety. You saw the Nürburgring cancelled this year and instead moved to Hockenheim for the first time. So, yeah, it's definitely a sort of, again, radical time in Formula One. Drivers pushing for their lives to be taken in consideration more. Obviously, the death of Bruce McLaren as well as Goodwood. It was a sad season, but also, I think, an important one in the history of Formula One and history of safety in Formula One.
And would you say that he's perhaps a bit forgotten as a champion of safety because Jackie Stewart gets so much praise for it? Jochen Rindt, I mean, I didn't really know how important he was in implementing safety features, and I think he should be remembered more for that because, well, it was very important.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, his crash in Italy, I know we're probably going to get more into that later on, but it was kind of unacceptable. The actual cause of death although a lot of people remember that he didn't correctly secure the 5-point harness, he only connected 4 points of it because he was worried if he was in a fire, he would have to get out quickly. But the actual cause of death was labeled as poorly constructed crash barriers and not being maintained properly. So I think that people were starting to get fed up with the FIA/F1's lack of safety concerns at the circuits too.
Yeah, I think Rindt, he ends up being forgotten for a lot of things, mostly because his career was cut short. I mean, he's most people will remember him as the driver that won the title posthumously. But the thing is, because he died early, his career record is not as well decorated as it could be. When it comes to safety, I suppose I associate him. He's more good at drawing attention to this is a problem or that these are my concerns. I feel like with Stewart, he was the one who was better at actually giving practical ideas of saying we need full face helmets, we need to wear seatbelts like this, we need to have, the marshals need to have fire extinguishers, that sort of thing. That's kind of how I associate them. But I think in general with Rindt, it's always a question of if he hadn't died, obviously he would have won the title. More than likely. I mean, it's hard to think of a way. Obviously, it would have changed. Obviously, butterfly effects, things would have changed had he not there. But I seriously doubt he would have had 4 retirements in a row after this, and somehow lost the title to Ickx. You're always left wondering how long would he have gone on. He could have. I mean, he'd started in 65 or 64. He could have gone on till maybe 75, 76 fairly easily if he wanted. If he'd got any more championships, because Lotus in the first half of the decade was still quite good, so he very easily could have won more with them. That's always a big question, I find, with anyone that dies early.
Yeah, and just going back to the racing bit, Jochen Rindt, he was very well rounded as well. As I think the listeners might know, but in the 60s, drivers used to not only race into all the kinds of formula racing, but they would often compete in Le Mans, go to Indy. Rindt had won the 1965 Le Mans, which was a very impressive drive. He was not the favorite at all. Jackie Ickx said that him and his, Rindt and his teammate, co-driver Gregory were both maybe a bit psychotic in the race because there was a big risk because of issues with the car, and they still just powered through because they wanted the win. And as I said before, in Formula 2, he was seen as the king of Formula 2, which was a big honor at the time when Formula 2 was very well regarded and wasn't much slower than Formula 1. In 1967, he dominated the season. He wasn't registered as winner because he was already a Formula 1 driver and already had 3 seasons under the belt. So Jackie Ickx was seen as the winner. But Rindt had 29 victories in Formula 2, which I think might have been the most at the time. I'm not too sure. But yeah, he was very well regarded. And yeah, that's what a lot of the older drivers saw as well, which also brings us to another unexpected contender we had in 1970, who was Jack Brabham. Jack Brabham, who obviously founded the Brabham team, and Rindt used to drive the Brabham cars in Formula 2. Brabham was 43 at the time, and I think that some people going into the season, as good as Brabham was, thought that he was starting to maybe fade away a little bit, yet he won the first race, and he ended up being an unexpected contender.
Yeah, he'd received criticism of his age and concern long before this, because in 1966 at the Dutch Grand Prix, he actually walked onto the grid with a fake grey beard and with a cane, and then won the race and lapped the entire field. But yeah, he was a good example of longevity at the time, because the average age of drivers was definitely older. But he'd been at this point, he'd been in Formula 1 since 1955. One of a relatively few drivers to have raced across 3 separate decades as well. But he'd been. I mean, his third title had been in '66, and then he'd finished runner-up to his teammate / employee in 1967, but then 68 and 69, there have been a lot of retirements and a couple of podiums hadn't been very good. And then, yeah, he started off 1970 with a win. And so you thought maybe it's his chance to his chance to take another title, but obviously a mixture of reliability and also just a few poor drives from him, and that couldn't happen.
It's really interesting to see with Brabham that despite his age in 1970, he was actually, I would say, on top form still, especially in the first half of the season. He had two, I would say, big moments that kind of cost him a hope of a championship this year, which in Monaco, he was leading the race for pretty much the entire time. It looked really comfortable. In the final lap, I think it was a spin or a crash, and that cost him the win to Rindt, and he finished second behind. And similar in Brands Hatch as well that year. He was running in first, looking like it was going to be an easy win for him, and then just starts running out of fuel towards the end, and again coasts it over in second to Rindt's first. If it hadn't have been for those incidents, like you say, butterfly effect, we don't know for sure, but he would have been leading the championship by 1 point after Britain. From there, I think his season just got plagued with DNFs. I think the car seemed to fall away from him a bit because he didn't manage any points in, I think, the last 7 races of the year. So that might have been what pushed him towards retiring in 1970, because it started off so strong for him and then it seemed to just fall away.
Yeah, I mean, Monaco that year, it's kind of Canada 2011 meets Macau 2017, I think it is, the year when Dan Ticktum and Ferdinand von Habsburg, was it? They crashed at the last corner.
I think it was 17.
Yeah, because it was because Monaco, it was actually at the very last corner. It was, I've forgotten the name of it now, but it was the corner that when it used to just be a hairpin, where now we've got Raskas and Anthony Nogues. And yeah, he just went offline and caught the marbles and hit the wall and let Rindt through to take the win. It is interesting though, because at this time, even with a season where you don't score many points, because in a race in a year of 13 races, he only scored 4 points 4 times, even though they were all podiums. He still finished 6th in the championship, because back then obviously only the top 6 got points. Cars weren't very reliable, so you could often finish really high up the standings without needing to do much. And like you said, he could have been leading the championship after Silverstone had he won it, even though there had been 3 races where he hadn't scored points. It's a very different system to now, because now you basically have to score points in every race if you want to be anywhere near competitive, because you can't rely on your rivals having their cars break down anymore.
No, it's really interesting to look back, especially I think 2023 F1 season. I don't know if you guys would agree, but I think it's been one of the most reliable seasons for the cars. We haven't seen many mechanical DNFs, which is really interesting, because then you look at a season like this and drivers with 4 or 5 DNFs are still winning and leading the championship, still with a chance of winning the championship. I just find it really interesting how F1 is changing at the moment from being a competition of building the right car and trying to make it consistent to now you have to be at the front in every race to even stand sort of a chance of the championship. You can still obviously get away with a DNF here and there or a bad finish in 1 or 2 races, but back then it was like you need the car to cross the line first and foremost and then worry about points later.
Yeah, exactly. I know Peter must have the exact numbers, but there hadn't been a race when everyone had finished in like decades, and then it happened, I think, in 2022 or 1 for the first time, like in ages, and then this year it's happened a few times, and it's just a bit annoying. And I've said it before, but that's when you miss a bit some of those. Either you miss the unreliability, but you also miss some of the drivers who would be a bit more rush and maybe cause a few incidents. Because when you see all the drivers finish the race, it does make you lose a bit of what Formula One is about. Of course, you don't want anyone to be injured, that's for sure. But when you don't have anyone who gets any reliability issue, you do just wonder a little bit: is this normal? So even yesterday, I saw a viral Reddit post about, should we make cars unreliable again for the drama purposes? Well, good luck telling the teams to do that, because the teams love the fact that they cars are finishing. That the sponsors love it because they get more TV time. Unless you're Alfa Romeo or Haas, then you don't get any TV time. But yeah, back in the day, you just had to finish the race because the 3 points you earned by finishing fourth somewhere could give you the title, and then you're remembered as a great forever.
So I do indeed have a spreadsheet that has all this data. So I did
There you
one
go.
basically looking at the finishing rate. So I took I haven't differentiated between drivers crashing and having mechanical retirements. I've just looked at how many drivers started each race and how many of them crossed the finish line. So it's not including people that were classified but maybe retired in the last 10% of the race distance. So from that perspective, the most reliable or best finishing year on record is 2021, which has a finishing rate of 87.4%. 23 is 85.9, but almost all of that was from accidents because there were barely any mechanical retirements this year. 1970 is... Where is 1970? 1970 had a finishing rate of 51.7%. It's kind of in the middle. That's out of 26, 43rd out of the 73 seasons we've had. So fairly, yeah. So kind of in the middle. Only just below 1999, which is interesting. The worst season on record, just for fun, is 1984 with a 40.5%. Obviously, in the heyday of turbos. But yeah, it was a time when you could most of the time most retirements were because of mechanical problems. Accidents weren't as common as they were in the era of pay drivers in the 90s and noughties. It has taken things away of modern F1 because you look at in any other era, Max never would have won as many races as he did. For the back markers, they don't have any chance of scoring points unless they pull off a really clever strategy as well, because you can't sit there waiting for everyone else in front of you to break down. And it has taken away that element of just surprise and kind of suspense. And in the 70s, you still had that, because even as dominant as the Rindt was in the Lotus, he still had a few engine breakdowns in races that kept it reasonably close, where if it was a year where it never broke down, he could have won every single race that year, probably.
And another thing is, well, just because we're still in the section on Brabham, do you think this was also a bit of a turning point for the other old, wily old fox on the grid, who was Graham Hill, who obviously was not in a factory team at that point, but he had, a season to forget because maybe he just saw all his other old rivals or new rivals just take the limelight and he take the spotlight on them, and he was just a bit behind. He scored 7 points that season, I think, and well, that's just not what we had started expecting from a guy who was one of the best drivers of the 60s.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but Graham Hill was coming off the back of an injury from the Indy 500 this season. So I think his performance was a little bit lackluster. And as far as I'm aware, was he driving a car as well that was reasonably unreliable, a little bit slow that season? I think he might have had a V12 engine that wasn't performing to sort of the spec of the Cosworth we were talking about earlier.
So it was still a Cosworth V8, and it was still firstly the 49C, then the 72C, but it was for the Rob Walker team. So obviously not preferential treatment from the manufacturer.
So Rob Walker, that's the Lotus factory team, but the Brook Bond, I think that was he did. I think it was this
Brook
year,
Bond, yeah.
I think it was this year when they had that gas turbine engine they tried at maybe one race, and I think he tried using that. But yeah, so the big difference, yeah. So the injury, yeah, it was the United States Grand Prix. The previous year, he'd broken both his legs and had to have surgery on his knees, and he could still barely move his legs, but still came back to racing. But yeah, he was using the Lotus 49 for most of the season, whilst Rindt was using the 72. So that makes quite a significant difference. But yeah, I suppose by this point, again, another one, he'd been in F1 for 12 years, very seasoned, just was kind of fading. And from 70, his last win was the year before at Monaco. His 6th win or 5th or 6th. He was known as Mr. Monaco at the time. But beyond this, he just got barely any, because he did a couple of years of Brabham, and then he started his own team, and that didn't work. And it was just kind of the beginning of the end, I think. And I think you could describe it as a passing on of the baton to Rindt.
Yeah, definitely. And well, Rindt was seen as a young driver at the time, even at the time that his age was young, and his main rival, even in Formula 2, as I said before, was Ickx, who was definitely the third contender for the title. Ickx was at Ferrari, who had just made a very good car, but they had started the season very slowly, and Ickx's results were just not there. Was it the team? Was it the driver? What do you guys think?
I think it's interesting in that 1970 season with the Ferrari because, like I said, they're trying this new engine that no one else is really running. Everyone's sticking with the Cosworth that they're used to. The season starts off, like you said, slow, but it also doesn't. I think in a couple of races, Ickx was really close to Rindt, battling for the lead, and it was always that reliability issue. I had the stat with me yesterday. He DNF'd in something like 4 out of the first 6 races. It was insane. Yeah. He just kept having these mechanical failures, Ickx. And then at the end of the season, it really starts to pick up. And I think they sort of worked through some of those reliability problems they saw towards the start with that new engine. So I'll be curious to see what you guys think of that as well.
Yeah, I think this really sums up what I was saying about how you could get away with having an unreliable car. That he finished runner-up, and you look at his results. He got 3 wins near the end of the season, but he had 6 retirements from 13 races, and then another one where he didn't score points. So he scored points in less than half of the races, and that was still enough for him to finish runner-up. Admittedly, 2 of those wins probably would not have happened without Rindt, and the one in the United States, that was the one that basically cost him the title because it was Rindt's replacement, Emerson Fittipaldi, that took his first win there. Yeah, it was a year. In any other year, he wouldn't have been a shoe-in for the title, but because of Rindt's death, that was what made it happen. It would have been if Rindt had seen out the season, it would have been seen as years like last year or 92 or 2011, where nobody else has a shoe-in for the title, and it's just kind of waiting for them to find out which race are they going to take it at.
Yeah, because when he had to deliver, to be fair, Ickx was very good in qualifying, got 4 pole positions, I think, that year. But, well, when you think about it, that was his best shot at a title. And again, that opens up the discussion of, is he in that conversation of one of the very best drivers to never get an F1 title? And if so, when should he have won it? Because the obvious one is 1970, but did he have any other real opportunity? Because if he wins an F1 championship, well, we know he is an all-time racing great, but he genuinely, for me, maybe goes higher than the likes of Jim Clark and Graham Hill, because Ickx has won absolutely everything outside of F1. It's just incredible, just his racing CV. And when you think that he was a few points away from winning in 1970, we really could have looked at an all-time great there.
I think it's no question that Ickx is a good driver. I think everyone would agree. I think it's more, 1970 was a lot of mechanical DNFs for him. I think the car wasn't there. And after that, like you said, did he really have another opportunity at the title? Probably not. The question really is, we've talked about how unreliable that Ferrari was. Was it that in that race in the USA where Emerson Fittipaldi took the win, we know that Ickx suffered from another mechanical problem, but the team claim they found nothing. Did he give up that 1970 title for Rindt's legacy, thinking, he'd have another shot in a couple of years? Or do you think it was genuinely just a mechanical fault? Because he's hinted at both. He's never given a definitive answer. He said, I think recently that he wouldn't have wanted to win 1970 and take that away from Rindt. So there's been this sort of conspiracy the whole time of, did Ickx actually want to win the 1970 championship?
I think maybe that's probably there is a case to be made that he deliberately threw it, because it's if he did win it, it would be hanging over him constantly. That and you can picture how this would be if Twitter existed in 1970. That he wouldn't be acknowledged as a proper champion, because they're like, oh, you only got it because Rindt is dead. It's the closest comparison I can think of to this is 1961. That's a little bit different though, because Von Trips died in the race, and then Phil Hill won the race and got the title. It wasn't like it happened several races earlier and he was just playing catch up. But that's another one where he kind of won the title on a technicality. But this, Ickx is an interesting one, because for me, I don't follow any racing outside of Formula One particularly closely. Most of what I knew before I was following Formula One was from playing Gran Turismo and knowing a bit about Le Mans and everything. I knew who Ickx was, but not because of Formula One. I didn't realize he was in Formula One. I knew about Le Mans and everything because he's such a seasoned driver. I mean, his professional career went on for just over 20 years. So he's been around a lot. But Formula One, he took several wins and a lot of podiums, but it was a very disjunct kind of stop-start career. He had a lot of seasons where he would do only one race, comparatively few full-time years. Again, his stint at Ferrari, he had a 4-year stint there. Maybe wasn't as successful as it could have been, but then this was a bit of a low point for Ferrari early 70s until they brought in the 312T, and then that really kicked off their next major period of success. I made a huge error in one of my videos, and then again in another one, talking about the FISA FOCA war, because I said that at the race in South Africa where they boycotted it and stayed in that hotel, that the only one that didn't get on the coach was Jackie Ickx, who was covering for another driver, and this is about 3 years after he'd retired. So that's me not doing my research and probably not knowing as much about him as I should. But yeah, he was there throughout the whole 1970s, but I think he would have won the title, and it might have been viewed in a similar light to someone like Phil Hill of being one of the lesser known ones, but also like, well, he only got this because it should have gone to Rindt.
Yeah, because as I said, he won. When I say he won in everything, I really mean everything. He won in Dakar. He won the Bathurst 1000 in Australia. He won the Can-Am Series, and then obviously Le Mans. He won it like 6 times. So I just cannot think of any driver who actually managed to win Dakar, Can-Am, Le Mans, Bathurst, and even if he would have won Formula One in that way, I think it would have been utterly incredible. But obviously he didn't have the chance again. And yeah, with what Dan said about the conspiracy that he might have not won it on purpose, I knew Ickx quite well because I really got into F1 through a series called Michel Vaillant, which is just, it's a cartoon, not cartoon. Yeah, it's like a book that started in France in the 90s, I believe, or 80s. And basically, it's about this French driver who enters F1 and loads of racing categories and who becomes F1 world champion and who wins Le Mans and all kinds of stuff. But they put a lot of real drivers in there, and Jackie Ickx was always like the best driver in that series because he was so dominant in so many different categories of racing. And it was always put forward to the reader that he was a very classy figure who thought a lot about those things, about how he would be perceived, how he would just be portrayed in the media. And it's not, it's not as mad as it might seem nowadays that he didn't win on purpose. Because especially back then in the 60s and 70s, yes, there was no Twitter. But if you're not liked, then you will have drivers crashing into you and not getting any consequences for it, and people will forget it. You didn't want enemies back then, especially in some categories outside of Formula One, where genuinely you had bad guys, you had people who did not care at all. So yeah, that could have happened. And well, in the end, would you say that he has a good legacy in Formula One? Because yeah, Peter said that we just remember him for a few podiums. But is he still an F1? Well, not an F1 great, but someone who has a good legacy in Formula One? What do you think, Dan?
Would argue he does have a good legacy in Formula One. I think the further back you go in F1, the less people tend to remember the drivers as it is. And Ickx is one of those names that gets brought up all the time, despite him not winning a championship, which is something a lot of drivers from that period don't get the recognition of. I would say from the 70s, Ickx, Regazzoni, maybe Amos, they get brought up despite not being champions. I think from before that, you've got Sterling Moss as well, would be brought into that conversation of greats who didn't win the World Championship. Obviously, they won races. But yeah, I think Ickx is remembered as a great still. And if he, like you said, he's very media conscious. If he was thinking about that, he would probably know that he's still considered a great driver. At that point, he probably thought he was going to be in F1 for a lot longer and would have another shot at the championship. I don't think it is that far-fetched to think Ickx probably didn't want that 1970 championship hanging over him. People saying, well, did he really deserve it? Rindt was faster for the first half of the season. Was it fair of him to take that championship off him? I think he knew he had the talent to back up, anything he wanted to say. He could say he's a good driver, and I think he knew he had the talent to back that up and be portrayed still in a good light in the media. And hopefully for his sake, he wanted another chance at the championship, and then unfortunately didn't get it. So in my mind, yeah, he is one of those greats.
And just lastly, before we look at the actual races and the key moments of the 1970 season, I think we should talk about the teammates of all of those drivers we mentioned, because back then, well, not in all cases, but you would often have a very, very clear number one driver. One of the classic seasons we covered recently was the 1981 season, where we covered Caesar's Palace, but we ended up covering 1981 as a whole, and how Nelson Piquet's teammate was Rebacke, who was extremely mid, as we would say today. Well, Rindt had John Miles as a teammate who, well, I let you guys talk about his achievements. Jackie Ickx's teammate at first was not Clay Regazzoni, who went on to have a decent career. But, well, at first he didn't really have a teammate. Then for some races he had the Ignazio Giunti, who also didn't achieve much. And Jack Brabham had Rolf Stommelen. So what do you guys think about that dynamic they had back then of sometimes really having just a number two driver who, well, you just wondered, why are they there?
I think it was just everything was a bit less official. Obviously, you still had contracts and all of that, but they would switch drivers in and out more. The thing that they didn't, it wasn't quite so organized or, dare I say, professional as now. It was whoever had the money. I mean, we kind of got out of that phase. This is mostly in the 50s of having genuine amateur drivers that would build their own cars and use those and just enter them for one race a year or something. By this point, that had pretty much ended. I mean, the last time we've really seen that was the South African Grand Prix. You would get a whole bunch of South African drivers that would never do any other races. Lotus hadn't done this so much before because they had Clark and Hill in the team together for a while. Obviously, two obvious number one drivers, both multiple champions, and then we lost Clark. But John Miles was someone, maybe it was the car flattering, but he was held in reasonably high regard. But then because of Rindt's death, he ended up retiring early. And then they brought in Rainer Wissel, and that didn't really go anywhere. Obviously, Emerson Fittipaldi, that did. Yeah, it's not, in one sense, it's not too different from now and that you get drivers. I mean, Ferrari are especially bad at this, of having a number one and a number two. And clearly, I think that's always been the case when you look at this one as well.
I think when you look at the number twos in the teams at this time, you've got to remember Formula One is such an expensive sport. Like we said, development was still a little slow at this time. Teams were experimenting quite a bit with what would and wouldn't work. I believe John Miles was running the 72B as opposed to Rindt's 72C. So I think for some of the races, Rindt did have the upper hand in machinery. And it's likely that, you'd have a second driver, you'd put them in a slightly lower spec of car or not give them all of the upgrades or the newest parts because Formula One was just so expensive at the time. And we've not got like we have massive companies like Red Bull now that are multi-billion-dollar. They can afford 2 extremely fast race cars, but at that time, teams, it was a little harder to come by that cash to get you 2 race-winning cars in Formula One.
Yeah, it was definitely Formula One's always been expensive. Obviously, not nearly to the rate that it is now, but I think everything is relative. They didn't have as much money to spend on car development, but then also the drivers weren't paid as much, assuming they were paid at all, because it didn't really get. It wasn't until the 80s that it got this proper sort of glamour image that it has now. It was still kind of rough and ready a bit in the 60s and 70s. It was just a very different environment. It also, because of broadcasting at the time, it wasn't like every race was broadcast live in every country in the world. It was very stop and go. Some races they would do it, others would just be highlights, some wouldn't get broadcast at all, and you could only find out the results by reading the newspaper. Yeah, everything was a lot less regulated. It was a lot more casual, I think, in how it operated.
Yeah, definitely. And now going into the actual results of the season, if you look at just the winners up to, of course, the Italian Grand Prix, which is, I guess, the watershed moment of the season, 5 different teams had won, 5 different drivers. Well, Regazzoni got pole position at the last race, but 4 different drivers had gotten pole positions. Just looking at that, it definitely looked like a very entertaining season, but of course Rindt was the only one to actually win several races up to his death, because Brabham had won 1 race, Stewart had won 1 race, Pedro Rodriguez had won 1 race, Jackie Ickx had won 1 race, Jochen Rindt had won 5 of them, and he definitely shone through in the actual races, because a lot of drivers said that he was one of those racers who knew how to manage an actual race, which was obviously very important in an age of unreliability and just of management, not so much tire management, but just engine and car management. And it started in South Africa with Rindt getting a DNF after having a contact with Brabham.
Rindt, I think, like you said, good car management here was so important. I think Ickx had chances definitely early season to take victories, and then not being able to manage that car, and unfortunately, having reliability issues. France being, I think, a key one for Ickx there. He was leading the race early on. This was where that powerful engine, it was long straights through France, one of the last sort of public road circuits where they were just flying along an absolutely hugely lengthy circuit, and Ickx leading there quite comfortably, and then not being able to manage that car reliability, costing him the race win again to Rindt. I think Rindt, he was good at capitalizing on other people's mechanical DNFs, just pushing the car a little bit too much. You already mentioned Brabham's fuel in Brands Hatch, and as well, obviously, the final lap incident in Monaco. So Rindt being consistent, like you said, was key, I think, to him securing so many victories during that first stage of the season.
Wasn't it in France when he got hit in the face of a stone or something? There was one of the circuits had really bad, like lots of gravel on the track, and there was one of the races he got hit in the face with a stone, because this is before they wore full face helmets and they just had like a cotton balaclava covering the face. Maybe it wasn't France, because he won that race, but that was done at Charade Circuit, which went around an old volcano. When you look at it, it looks more like a rally stage than a Formula One circuit. Yeah, it was just things like that you kind of had to contend with, I think, and that obviously is more of a safety element. But he had those retirements, but generally, I mean, four wins in a row was really rare back then. Ascari had done it. Fangio probably had, but nobody else had really been able to do that, because even if the car was amazing and the driver was amazing, it still would break down. So he was very lucky to have actually played it well, and also because 2 of those wins weren't even from pole as well. So he was very lucky to kind of be able to find that window and break ahead like that.
Yeah, definitely. And well, just looking at the results, I was also gonna maybe ask you guys, were the tires relevant back then? Because I have no idea. And well, I can see that they used to use Dunlop, Firestone, and Goodyear. Were they in any way important in the races? Because I know that I can see that the first 3 wins were by cars using 3 different tires.
As far as I know, tire management and any sort of change in the tires, it was a lot more relaxed than it is now. You didn't need to worry about it as much. I think your fuel and your engine reliability was more important in these races. But that being said, it was still a tricky sort of balance to find. I know, for example, the United States Grand Prix in this season at Watkins Glen, they had a situation where the pit lane was basically completely covered in water that had run from the rain, but then the circuit was mostly dry, and they didn't really have the sort of tires to deal with that. So the tire engineers really struggling and leaving it up to the drivers to just kind of manage their way through a bit of a flooded pit lane. So tires, I think, less important in this time, but still something you have to think about. I know punctures were an issue in France for one of the Ferraris, I believe, got a puncture in France that cost them a good finishing position. So something you have to be mindful of, but I don't think as important as they are today.
Yeah, they were a lot more durable back then. There wasn't this. I'm not sure if they had different compounds instead of soft hard or anything like that, and I'm pretty certain they didn't even use slicks. They'd only recently introduced the very wide body wheels, because mid 60s they still had the very, very narrow tires, similar to the ones they had in the 50s. Although the 50s ones were these big spoked things that they come off like a motorbike or something. But yeah, they'd started getting the very wide rear tires, but generally speaking, they were very durable. Although I do know the Monaco race, he was driving the 72, but he was using tires designed for the 49, and they didn't really work with it. It wasn't these days. A lot of it is to do with how the tires fit around aerodynamics, because you get the dirty air at the front that gets caught underneath the rim, and how that affects airflow over the bodywork. Back then, that barely mattered because the aero was so primitive. It was more just about general grip levels, and of course, this was still an era where they would do a lot of like drifting in corners and sticking the rear end out. Yeah, because there have been drivers for Jody Scheckter. Obviously, this is a little bit before he entered Formula One. Is that he's complained a lot about modern F1 because the tires don't work, and they're constantly they wear out so fast, and everyone is obsessing over tire strategy and tire management. And back in the 70s, you just didn't have to do that. They could probably last the whole race if you wanted. So they're not. Yeah, tires are not nearly as much of a factor as they are today.
Yeah, okay. And well, tires were not a factor back then, but deaths definitely were, because obviously we are going to address the elephant in the room, which is Rindt dying in Italy. But let's not forget that Bruce McLaren had also died in that year, and that had already set kind of a ominous feel on the grid for most drivers, especially for Jackie Stewart and Jochen Rindt. How did you think? Well, how was it received when that happened? Do you think it was already a watershed moment even before Rindt's death, that such a prominent driver had passed away?
Well, this is one of those rare F1 seasons where you had 2 deaths as well. So you had obviously Rindt in Italy, and in Zandvoort too, there was Pierce Courage as well passed away, who was one of Rindt's close friends, I believe, in the paddock. So as well as McLaren dying at Goodwood, 3 F1 driver deaths, 2 of them actually happening in F1. It was definitely a season I think would put a toll on any driver's mind. It's so tough because I think F1 sometimes needed things to happen like this to push safety forward, because at the end of the day, the FIA were just too lackluster with things. They would only implement it once it was too late. They would never really see accidents coming. I think Stewart being probably one of the only people that was a big advocate for, well, come on, this is just common sense. We need to do this. But Yeah, it was a real tough season, I think, for drivers. 1970, again, it's a big change. You're coming from this 60s era where it's gone from amateur racers in the 50s to a more professional championship. The cars are getting a lot faster. Aerodynamics are playing a more important role. You've got this Lotus 72 that is bringing radical changes in where it's placing the radiators and with the brakes that inevitably would fail and cause Rindt's death. So it's a real tricky season, I think, to talk about, because as exciting as it was, it's also got this sort of big, like you said, elephant in the room that is multiple drivers losing their lives over the course of the year.
Yeah, it's similar to 1994 in many respects of being two of the biggest paradigm shifting ones for safety and just a general feeling that things need to change. And since 94, we have been better at actually implementing new safety standards before the accident happens, rather than waiting for something to happen and then realizing we need to do that. Which I guess is one of the reasons we've seen so few deaths in recent decades. But yeah, losing Bruce McLaren, I mean, so he's somebody who mostly earlier in the 60s had been close to winning titles but hadn't taken any, and now he was another driver to have started his own team. Yeah, I think it would have been a big shock like any of them, but the thing is, in the years before, there had been several big drivers to have lost their lives. I mean, as we mentioned, Lorenzo Bandini, Jim Clark as well, Wolfgang von Trips. Yeah, I mean, his was happening. It was obviously because it was actually in a Can-Am car, not a Formula One car. So that shows that these safety problems, it wasn't just unique to single seaters. It was something pretty much happening across the board in F1 in motor racing. Yeah, it took that away. I think to have the deaths of three such significant drivers in 1 year was kind of a lot to take.
Yeah, and we must remind everyone that Rindt's death was actually because his throat was cut open. A lot of people say that it was maybe partly a reason of the fact that he would only use 4 of the points on his harness, which he used to do only to be able to get out of the car if needed to, because he didn't fully trust the safety. Well, rightly so, he didn't fully trust the safety system. They also the crash barriers at Monza were also criticized. There were a lot of issues, not just the cars, the actual tracks were not safe. And then, there's this quote from Joe Bonnier, who just said, at least he died doing something he loved to do. And that was often what drivers had to resort to saying. They just had to say, look, at least he was happy. He was in Formula One. Yes, he died, but he knew the risks. But as we said, Rindt knew the risks, but when his friend Piers Courage died, he very nearly retired, and he considered it a lot, and he was vocal about it, which I think not many drivers did at the time, because it was just a bit of a taboo subject to really mention.
It's interesting that you talk about sort of Rindt. He actually was, looking at a lot of the quotes, very safety conscious, and I think it did play on his, and I imagine other drivers' minds, the risks that they were taking during this time in F1. For example, France practice of this year, Rindt suffered a steering failure in the car, and he goes, if this happens again and I survive, I'll kill all of you. We already know, obviously, he had a bit of a shaky relationship with Colin Chapman, and then during this practice in Italy, it was the brakes that initially failed that sent Rindt into the crash barrier. So it was almost if he knew how big the risks were driving this radical new car, and the safety of F1 just not really being up to standard even for the 1970s. So having the weight of the other driver playing on his mind still as well, and him having it very conscious in the back of his mind, I suppose in some way you could say, well, did he see it coming? But at the same time, anytime you step into these situations, you always think, well, it's not going to be me. It could be someone else, but it wouldn't be me. And I think having to come to terms with that reality can be really tough for anyone in a dangerous situation.
Yeah, it is interesting, and this is something that happens with basically all drivers is that you never, as aware they can be of the dangers of doing what they do, you just don't think about it until you're actually in that situation. You just don't think it's going to happen, or it's not on your mind. This was even the case. Like, I mean, I did a track day a few months ago in a Formula Renault car, and I was like, okay, this the thing's about 30 years old. There's no halo. It's just a very simple harness, and I'm going much faster than I've ever gone on any public road. If something goes wrong, what's going to happen? But I was driving. You just didn't really think about that so much. You just kind of concentrate on driving it. And I guess you have to think about things being relative, because obviously at the time they could obviously see, oh, we could have better barriers here, or we could have seatbelts or helmets, but this is before they could have envisioned having things like carbon fiber, like safety cells, and the onboard not the biometric data they've got now for monitoring heartbeats, or even the Halo and the hands device. That's stuff that they couldn't even envision, but they obviously knew that there were flaws because deaths were so frequent, and Formula One and motorsport is quite unique in that most other sports you don't expect people to die doing it typically, and so that makes it stand out a lot. Monza itself, so seatbelts were very new. They weren't compulsory yet, but they were, and so that was how he essentially got away with not doing up the fifth harness. And you had to balance it, because the biggest problem that most cars had at this time wasn't so much breaking apart or things flying into the cockpit, it was catching fire. And that was still very common. And we'd seen in 68, Joe Schlesser had died because Honda had this brainwave, let's make a car out of magnesium because it's lighter. And then, of course, it goes up and burns in this white hot flame. They were that was one of the two main safety features they were trying to introduce at the time. Wasn't so much to do with the strength of the cars, it was more trying to make the fuel tank a bit more robust, and also improve the opening of the cockpit so drivers can get out faster. That was the two main concerns, rather than strengthening the cars up. But another thing that leads to that is that this version of Monza was basically the same as the current one, just without the chicanes. And the only change they'd made since they'd introduced Monza, first been built in the 1920s, was to get rid of the oval, the massive oval section. So it was shorter, but it was still a really, really fast circuit that had only 2 braking points, essentially. And it was the second of these where the accident took place, which was also in pretty much the same location as Von Trips' accident nine years earlier.
Yeah, and the thing is, even when the actual race took part, going back to the actual race, Jackie Ickx was on pole, and we mentioned how, maybe especially the US Grand Prix, maybe he didn't give it his all because of what was at play, because of how he realized he could actually become a world champion. Well, Italy was definitely not one of those moments, because his clutch just gave up. And, well, Clive Gazzoni goes on to win, and at that point, Ferrari probably has the faster car by quite some margin. But all of the drivers just had it on their mind that, the very likely world champion had died. And I don't think that race was ever in a conversation to get cancelled, was it?
As far as I know, there was no talks of cancelling it. And I mean, it always leaves a bit of a sour taste in my mind when I think about it, because you had that Ferrari win, which at the time, you can see footage, the crowd are just going wild. Obviously Monza, the home of Ferrari, so any sort of Ferrari victory there. But the drivers, I think I saw a clip of Regazzoni's face after he won that race. He just looks tired and sad. He isn't celebrating like you normally would for a Monza win with the Ferrari team. So it really was a sour race. And back then, if someone died in the race, you would just carry on for the weekend. Nowadays, it would be cancelled immediately if someone were to die in practice, and there'll be a huge look into what went wrong. But back then, it was, I wouldn't want to say the norm, because it still wasn't the norm, but it was a lot more common, and the race would go on.
Yeah, I think it was just because it was the done thing that you would carry on, and that went on for a long while because even Imola '94 they still did the race even with Ratzenberger's death. These days, yeah, they wouldn't do that. I mean, the most recent examples of this, not Formula One, but obviously Anton Hubert in Formula 2, they cancelled the feature race. Delano Van at Hoff, I can't remember if that was on the Saturday or the Sunday, but if they cancelled the next race afterwards in Frecker. But yeah, now at the time you would just carry on partly because it was the done thing, but I think also they felt almost as a way of honouring them, is that let's race anyway. But the mentality was different. It was starting to change at this point, but from the 50s mostly, it was a whole you're just if you want safety to be better or you don't want to race because you're scared, it's because you're a coward. Because a lot of these people were people who lived throughout World War II. Some of them had fought in it. They were used to seeing death and suffering, and so it didn't really affect them. It didn't really affect them so much. Whereas now, by the 1970s, you didn't have so many drivers that came from that generation, and it was more of an issue for them. But another thing that's interesting, and this is something that most teams did at the time for this race specifically, is they took all the wings off because the circuit was so fast you just didn't need them. So these days they'll run an extremely thin rear wing at Monza, and back then they just wouldn't run one at all. And with no chicanes, you may as well, because there's so few. There are so few braking points or any technical sections, and that itself would have had an effect, I'm sure, because that would have. It was a brake failure in the end, but that would have affected grip and stability, and that's another factor I think into why the accident took place.
I think as we close the analysis of the actual season, and how Ferrari were the fastest by the end, and Ickx won 2 of the last 3 races, but that wasn't enough to win the title. I think we have to talk about how Regazzoni won this race, and I think it was only his 5th race in Formula One, and he had only entered Formula One at the age of 31, after only getting into single-seater racing, I think, at the age of 29. Which I hadn't realized really up until doing the research for this episode. That's extremely late, and just didn't realize how late his arrival into racing was actually.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We touched on it before that drivers could get away with being a bit older back in these earlier days of F1. Firstly, the physical demand of the cars was a lot less. If you're in an F1 car nowadays, you've been put under such insane G-forces, you have to be in peak physical ability. But back then, the aerodynamics were a lot more primitive. So, like you said, you're just relying on the mechanical grip of the car, which doesn't put you under as much strain. And Regazzoni would be a big name for, I believe, quite a few years after this in Formula One, wouldn't he? I think if you think to like Lauda and Hunt in 76, Regazzoni is also there, I think, as Lauda's teammate backing him up. So he's a big name and a big name in race-winning cars, despite his age, which I suppose just a testament to how different the F1 grids were. We talked about Brabham too being in his 40s while racing and still winning some races in this season. So yeah, a really diverse grid.
Yeah, I mean, in 1974, Regazzoni was Fittipaldi's main rival for the title, and I think they go into the last race of the season tied on points. So yeah, it was incredible because he only got into racing at the age of 24, which even back then was extremely late, and he had to leave F1 because, again, big crash that got him, I think, paralyzed from the waist down, and he still raced a bit later on in the Dakar, among other things. But yeah, we talked about safety, but even 10 years later, you had drivers just getting paralyzed and having to end their careers.
Yeah, it makes you think how much really has changed. That by the 80s, now, they had full face helmets, they had proper harnesses, the cars are made of carbon fiber, they had wearing fireproof overalls, the marshals had fireproof overalls, they had proper fencing and barriers and stuff, but you were still having these kind of accidents. It shows you how much it takes to get to the stage that we're at now, where even injuries are rare in modern F1. I mean, you look at how well protected the drivers are, that they're so back in the 80s and 70s and earlier, you know, their elbows and shoulders would be sticking out. Their helmet was only just below the roll bar. But now the drivers, they've got the big cockpit sides and they've got the mirrors. They're very, very snuggled in, and they've got the halo as well. It is almost impenetrable. And the last major scare really was Grosjean, and that was the first time a car had gone up in flames like that. Well, basically since the 1970s. Yeah, but we've it's easy to think, oh, we've sorted everything, and then it just takes one accident where something happens. You think, okay, there are some holes somewhere that we need to fill.
Definitely, this was still a time in F1 where it was really dangerous, and I think there's always going to be something we can do to improve on safety. And it's impressive the drivers just so willing to still go out there and race. I mean, if you saw your rival, your friend, someone you knew in the paddock passing away like that, it should really be like a wake-up call. And I think with how close Rindt came to retirement, it shows that winning a world championship means so much to these guys. Being in that top car and just having that racing spirit in them, it means a lot, and it's really important to them. And I think that's why a lot of them chose to carry on despite the insane risk that they were taking.
It would be interesting to find out what the atmosphere was like at Watkins Glen when the race was done, and now they knew that Rindt was champion. To have them be champion in absentia, it must have been a very strange feeling. And then also they would have had I assume at the time they did a sort of FIA prize giving ceremony, because the closest thing you would have had to that in the future would have been 82, when how close Didier Pironi came to taking the title. He wasn't dead, but obviously he couldn't race anymore with his leg injuries, and he came very close to basically watching himself become champion from his sofa, watching it on television.
Yeah, I especially wonder because there was no team radio back then. So when Jackie Ickx got I think it was a fuel line issue at Watkins Glen that dropped him from. Well, he was running in second place at that point because Jackie Stewart had taken the lead. But when he had that issue, how the other drivers reacted to just seeing that red car go down the order and be like, okay, that must mean we have a dead driver who's going to win the championship. I wonder how they felt at that point, or even how the team principals and how the engineers thought.
But to touch on that with the Watkins Glen feeling, it was really bittersweet for Lotus. Obviously, it marked them securing the Drivers' and Constructors' Championship. It was also another huge achievement for that team. They'd just come back after Rindt's death that race, and Fittipaldi took his first victory for the team, obviously being their new driver post-Rindt. So you have that sort of feeling of joy of a new era, the car performing well still, a new driver who's looking like he's going to lead the team in a good direction. Obviously, Fittipaldi winning with Lotus in 72. So it was like the joy of that and securing the race win that day in the championships. But also, I think Chapman even said, it was bittersweet because he's got to remember what Rindt did and Rindt's passing. And it was a sad day too, to sort of receive those trophies, constructors and drivers, but not be able to share it with the driver who did most of that work for you.
Right. I think it's time to move on to the DRS rankings now. So for this one, we have so for our driver, so we've got Jochen Rindt. So let's try and give just a general assessment of him as a driver. Obviously, any champion is going to be good. He could have won. He potentially could have won more in the future. He's someone who has. There are so many what ifs. But I think he was obviously very highly rated at the time. Maybe has been a bit forgotten in later years. But I could see anywhere from B to S would be a good point for Rindt.
Definitely. I mean, it's hard because those first few years of his career he was in a really slow Cooper car, but his challenges for the titles were impressive. Obviously, I think mentioned Stewart and Ickx hold him in really high regard. So yeah, I would lean to being a B to A tier driver. Definitely don't think could potentially go S. Maybe needed a couple more years to see where he went with that.
Same, I would go for probably A, because we definitely saw in 1970 that a very good driver was coming together with those performances. As Peter said, 4 wins in a row was extremely impressive back then. Only the very best drivers had done it prior to him. So whatever the reason is, good reliability, good car, good driver, well, you needed all of them to come together to win 4 in a row. However, I wouldn't put him quite in S, because those are for the absolute legends of the sport, and we just didn't see enough. As sad as it is, we didn't see enough because he died, but I would still just put him in A, which is still very commendable for a driver who really gets forgotten a lot and just gets remembered as, oh, this guy who won posthumously.
Yeah, I think an A is fair. Yeah, he had the potential to become an S, but obviously just things didn't work out that way. So yeah, so and then for the track, it's the one of the older iterations of Monza, which is, as I mentioned before, basically the original layout minus the oval, but without any of the chicanes that we've had since. So a really fast layout. I like it from if you play it in Assetto Corsa, it's so much fun because of how fast it is, and because it has that really vintage look of it has the old Armco barriers and still all the trees, which obviously it still has today, but it doesn't have the runoff and the gravel that it did at the time. I don't know how much they'd approve of it from a safety and maybe even from a racing perspective. It would be interesting to see modern F1 attempt it, although we can't get rid of some of the chicanes, because it would be just because of how fast it would be, although you would have essentially only 2 braking points and overtaking probably wouldn't be that easy, but they probably wouldn't even need DRS either. It would be a very interesting experiment.
Well, one thing is, it was extremely entertaining to watch highlights, the few highlights that you can see from the 60s. Some people have compiled it on, not YouTube, but Dailymotion is always good for those older ones, if not other websites. And it was absolute chaos. You would have a different race leader every 2 laps. If you just look at the 1970 or 1971, basically, I don't know, some kind of chart they have on Wikipedia with the different leaders. It's a different color every 3 millimeters on your phone. It's absolutely insane. And obviously, in the 1971 race, it finished with the closest ever gap between first place and second place. And if you actually watch the finish, I think there are 5 cars just storming onto the finish line. So it was just slipstream chaos. And I think it would have been extremely entertaining to watch nowadays. And I think we would have seen Alex Albon winning probably. So I would give it an A just because it wasn't safe. But if we disregarded the safety features, it could have been S just because of how crazy it is.
Definitely. People back in the day, wouldn't they? They would compare it to the Indy 500. Sort of nowadays, we've got all that slipstream and drivers change for the lead. I watched a video yesterday actually about the 1970 Monza race, and it was 22 changes for the lead over the course of the race.
Yeah.
So, yeah, definitely an A-tier track at least.
It would just be because think about it like Indy. This circuit, it looks like if someone's taken Indy and just punched it inwards on itself. That's kind of how it looks. But yeah, you can see Williams would be just my time to shine if we raced here. Because all you need is straight line speed. We'd see such stupidly thin rear wings on the cars, but then also we might see Red Bull. Well, actually, they were they're good everywhere, but they were pretty good in a straight line because they had their triple DRS last year. But you might actually see some engines blowing up as well, because I don't think they're designed to run at full throttle that much. It would just be a fun experiment. But yeah, obviously the modern Monza is a classic, and this one as well. So for me, I'd give it an easy S too.
Interesting. Yeah, S could really fit here. I just thought about the safety features. Well, talking about safety, the race car we are rating today is the Lotus 72, so the 1970 Lotus. which was a very good car. Maybe it fell behind Ferrari at some point in the season when Ferrari introduced upgrades midway through the season. But then, as Dan said, Fittipaldi won at Watkins Glen, and it showed that that car was still good, and was definitely better than Ferrari at that in terms of race pace at least. Again, I would give it an A because I think S is really for the dominant cars that you just get bored of. Whereas, at least in 1970, when you get such a close season, at least in terms of pole position and fastest laps, and for the first part of the season, you can't just give S. So I would go for an A, also because the car looked great.
Yeah, with a car like this, I mean, it depends if you look at it just in 70. If we're going to get really specific, just the A spec, which is only used for like 2 races, but the 72 in general, they used that car for 5 seasons. By the end, it was pretty obsolete when it was in its E spec. But this is the one that really kind of brought the modern design to Formula One. It was the first one pretty much to have the same basic shape and layout that we have of the low down wings mounted on the side mounted radiators and all of that, and the suspension geometry and the brakes. And so it was a bit of a glass cannon because it did break down a lot, but it brought a lot of innovations at the same time. So I think maybe an A, I think would be a good one for me.
I'd have to agree with an A as well. I think this car, it was like you said, the start of sort of a modern Formula One car. It brought in quite a lot of innovations that we see were integral to the development of Formula One. And this is obviously the hype of this car for Jochen Rindt was that the only reason he even bothered staying with Lotus for 1970, despite him kind of resenting the team a little bit after 1969, was the promise of what this car would deliver. So for that, I think definitely at least an A.
Okay, so with that, I think that brings this episode to a close. Quite a trip. Well, I suppose I say memory lane. This is a year that predates all 3 of us by several decades. So it's kind of interesting to look back on something where we can't say, "Oh yeah, I remember watching that race" or whatever. And I think if we'd wanted to get on a driver from that era, that might have been a bit of a challenge. But also that would have been quite a significant moment for the podcast if we could have grabbed Jackie Stewart or Jackie Ickx or anything on. But yeah, it's an interesting one to look back this far because it doesn't really get covered so much by a lot of podcasts and a lot of YouTubers.
Yeah, and good way to remind the listeners that this is the main purpose of the podcast. You might have forgotten it a little bit because we did so many season review parts and we had to focus so much on the 2023 season due to so many races taking place in a season nowadays. But expect more of these more historical episodes on those drivers and those rivalries that really deserve more attention but just get less attention than George Russell and Lando Norris having a new helmet for a race.
I'm sure as F1 content creators, you'll agree that any chance we get to waffle on about old F1 and sort of the F1 history and things that we're really passionate about is just such a fun opportunity to have. So I just want to say thank you for you guys to just letting me come on this podcast and have a bit of a waffle about some old F1 stuff that is always really interesting to talk about.
Oh, you're welcome. So if you want to plug your channel, where can people find you on all the social medias?
You find me on pretty much everything under DanNoSkill. If you search it up on YouTube, ideally, then that would be great. But yeah, just DanNoSkill all over the internet: X, Instagram, TikTok, Twitch, YouTube, all that good stuff.
Well, opportunity for me to ask, why is it DanNoSkill, the username?
I suppose so that your expectation starts low, and that means I can hopefully beat that expectation somewhat.
Well, that's good because when I first saw your channel, I saw DanNoSkill F1 and I really thought all you would cover would be the most generic things. And then I ended up actually watching the content. So good name, stick with it, it works.
All right, there we go. It's working then. Thank you.
People always like it when they're a bit self-deprecating. I mean, obviously, Jimmy Broadbent, he's made a career out of being a not particularly good sim racer, but people love him for that. You've been listening to the DRS Train podcast. You can find us on YouTube and Spotify, and we're on Instagram and X at the DRS Train podcast. Make sure to tune in for our next episode. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.